Welcome friends, we are doing a series on history which is history of India from 1700 to 1950, and today in that series we will talk about the land revenue settlements during the colonial period. As we all know that when British they came to India, they devised a number of ways by which they could augment the kind of resources which they had. So initially they came as traders to India, and they were taking a lot of finished products from India, and in turn they were giving bullion to India in terms of gold and silver. But we find that over a period of time they engaged in the land revenue settlements, because initially they got the revenue collection of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa in 1765, and thereafter we see that the kind of political intervention which was made by the British during this time through the various land revenue settlements. The idea was to maximize the land revenue, how the British they could in a way increase their resources by increasing the land revenue. And we find that the impact of this kind of an increase was on the peasants, those who were living a very poor life. And through the various land revenue settlements which were introduced by the British in the different times, whether it was the permanent settlement or the Rayatwari or Mahalwari, all these three land revenue settlements, we find that the idea of the British was to increase the land revenue as more as possible. And we see that in these land revenue settlements which were introduced in different regions of India, and how different officials they were involved in that. So a lot of assessment which went into the introduction of the kind of methods which were being employed by the British. In terms of sources, one can refer to Dadabhai Naoroji's Poverty and British Rule in India, B.L. Grover's, and you look at Modern Indian History, and IGNOU source material which is for BA and MA. And we find that when British they were able to secure the land revenue in Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, and because of which now they were making investments in the sense that whatever land revenue they were securing in these regions, that was being utilized to develop their trade. Now they did not need the bullion which they were getting earlier. So this kind of a balance of trade now came into Britain's favor, which was not there earlier. And we find that this provided some kind of impetus to the growth or development in Britain as well, because now they were not getting any bullion to India. And we also find that how they were also harping on the maximum collection of the land revenue, so that they could use that money for not only purchasing the products, but also British they engaged in a number of wars in India. They fought wars with Marathas for that matter, or Mysore, and in other regions as well. So to increase their areas under the British, they fought a number of wars, and with this increase they were able to secure the resources of those regions. And so we find that how the colonialism in a way operated during that time. The appropriation of the land revenue or the kind of surplus which was there, that was the aim of the British. And we also see that how they introduced the surveys and the settlements, and in some cases they resumed the revenue free land grants by during the pre-colonial regimes which were given by them. And we find that they introduced a more efficient bureaucracy to collect the revenue. So in that sense they brought about a lot of changes, and they also continued with some of the earlier traditions as well. And we see that British they were concerned with commercialization, because of the fact because they wanted that the land revenue should be paid to them in cash. So that is why we find that commercialization of agriculture was promoted by them. And we also see that the high rate of assessment also played an important role in this. So we find that when one gets this kind of a right, where one is being given the authority to collect the revenue, it also shows the political dominance as well. So British were not only getting the revenue from these regions, but at the same time the political dominance was also being reflected when they were being given this kind of a right. So we find that they became some sort of landlords in India, and how systematically the colonial state expanded its control over other natural resources, whether they relate to the forest areas or water and the mineral and the human resources which were, and all of them they were there in plenty in India. And British, they used all these resources for their trade as well as finance, and they maintained their colonial authority due to this kind of a control over the resources. We also see that how British, they wanted to have some kind of a steady flow of income from the revenue to finance and plan its trading operations, as well as to raise the troops to conquer the new territories. And the conquering of the new territories again would augment their resources. And we find that during this particular period, a number of questions they surfaced, and they related to the question of conferring the ownership of propertyship and entrusting of the responsibilities of collection of state share in agricultural produce, etc. And these questions, they were resolved differently in different times and in areas, thus creating variants of land revenue settlements in these regions. And we find that the common feature of the land revenue settlement was the introduction of the notion of private property in land, which was not there in earlier times. And such kind of land proprietorship meant that its holders were granted the ownership rights. So we have seen in earlier times the right of proprietorship was not all that clear, and largely the land belonged to the rulers. But Britain or the British, they in a way invested such rights in the certain groups in accordance with the local conditions, and how zamindars, they became the proprietors of the land. So in this way we find that they favored certain groups of the landed magnates who were integrated in the colonial agrarian structure, and such groups were to become powerful allies of the British. And this was reflected during the revolt of 1857, when we see that many zamindars, they in a way supported the British because they were being given these kinds of benefits by the British. And we also see that when one is talking about that how British land revenue policy was operating, so we find that they wanted to maximize the land revenue demand as in a way wanted to augment the resources, and the revenue demands on the land, they were fixed in cash rather than on a proportion of produce or kind, and the assessments were generally exorbitant. So British, they in a way wanted to increase the land revenue, that is why the assessments were on the higher side. And they also wanted to in a way collect it by all means, because the way they imposed the laws, in that sense, when one is talking about the permanent settlement, then we have the sunset laws, that one has to pay the land revenue by the sunset of a particular date. And these kinds of collections were also very harsh in that sense, and British, they did not want to relent as well, because they felt that whatever the vagaries of the nature are, but their revenue should be in a way constant in that sense. So we find that the burden probably weighed more heavily as the prices of the agricultural commodities they dropped as well, and the assessments were particularly severe in the settlements introduced by Pringle in 1824-28 and by Wingate 1835-36 in the Bombay Presidency. And we find that because of the exorbitant land revenue demands, the peasants, they were borrowing money from the rural creditors and grain dealers to avoid the defaults. And the sale and the auction of land tended to increase, as cultivators usually borrowed money on the security of their newly acquired proprietary rights in land. So we find that not only the exorbitant land revenue demand, but how the peasants, they were seeking money from the creditors, the mahajans, those who were there, and they were forced into a system of bad debt, and this kind of a situation proved detrimental to the health of the peasants, because when they came under this kind of a system where they had to borrow money and huge debt which they acquired over a period of time. Apart from that, we also see that the rate of interest was always very high, and once the land went to the money lender, then it became very difficult to get it back for these people, despite paying so much money in terms of interest as well. And we find that when they were unable to pay those debts, then they had to in a way transfer their property to the money lenders, and this in a way not only was in a way situation was detrimental to the peasants, but at the same time we also find that it also created some kind of agrarian tensions as well. And we also see that the cultivators, they were not left with much resources at that point of time, and they were acting as buyers of the manufactured goods as well. And because the goods, they were coming from Britain, and these goods were manufactured, and how India became some sort of a colony which was supplying the raw materials to the British. So, to maintain their social stability in the markets in India, the colonial state was forced to ease the revenue demands after 1850s, and we find that in the revised settlements the revenue rates were brought down, but did this benefit the actual cultivators remained an open question. And when we find that Istmarari Bandobast, permanent settlement, was introduced in Bengal, the proprietary rights in the land were granted to the zamindars, and a group of people who had enjoyed the revenue collection rights under the Nawabs of Bengal as well, and some who had acquired such rights through the revenue farming or ijaradari under the company rule. So, we find that these people, those who are being given the rights to control the land or to in a way collect the land revenue, they became some sort of a powerful social group during the colonial period. And we also see that zamindars, those who were being given the proprietary rights under the permanent settlement, they paid some kind of a fixed land revenue to the East India Company. And when they were paying this kind of a fixed land revenue to the East India Company, then it was being assured that this particular amount would come to the British, and British wanted some kind of a constant flow of revenue to themselves, and that is why they kept this kind of a collection on a permanent basis. And we find that how peasants, they were at the mercy of the zamindars, because how zamindars became the sole proprietors of the land. And we also see that this kind of an ownership which was being given to them was made hereditary and transferable as well, and the privilege of disposing of land by sale or mortgage was also derived from this basic proprietary right given to the zamindars. So, we find when these zamindars, they were not able to pay the land revenue, then their zamindaris, they were also being sold by the British, and we also find that the proprietors many a times when they took loans, then they kept the land as mortgage. So, such kind of conditions, they were not conducive from the point of view of Indian peasants, because we find that all the three land revenue settlements introduced by the British, whether it was permanent, Raithwari or Mehalwari, all of them they in a way exploited the Indian peasants, and the revenue demand in all the three revenue settlements was very high. And we also see that how the composition of the zamindari class, it also changed since 1760s as a result of the entry of the speculators and merchants due to the practice of revenue farming. And we find that how zamindars initially were to give 10/11th of the assessed rental to the colonial state and keep 1/11th of the rental for themselves. So, we find that how the kind of money which was paid by them as land revenue was fixed in perpetuity, and if the rental of a zamindar's estate increased due to the expansion of cultivation area or rise in the agricultural productivity, or simply due to his capacity to extract money from the peasants, then he was entitled to keep the entire amount of that increase. and this would constitute a kind of unearned increment of his income. So we find that how zamindars, they were trying to extract more and more from the peasants. They wanted to increase their revenue, so they did not want to leave anything extra with the peasants, and peasants on the other hand, they were under a lot of stress because they had to pay a very higher end revenue, and apart from that, many times this was to be paid in cash. And thirdly, if they were not able to pay it on time, then again they had to bear the exploitation of the zamindar in that sense. So we find that during this particular period, most of the tenants, including the pre-existing khudkasht tenants, those were enjoying the occupancy rights in their lands, were reduced to the status of mere tenant at will of zamindars who could easily evict them and enhance their rents. So we find that even the khudkasht tenants, those who had these kinds of occupancy rights in their own lands, so now they were tenant at will and they were at the mercy of the zamindars, and how zamindars, they wanted to increase the land revenue which was coming to them. And many times we also see that the earlier the kind of customary rights of the peasants, such as the access to the pasture and the forest lands, use of the village ponds for fishing and revenue free homestead plots for growing vegetable, etc., now they were abrogated. So the earlier customary rights, they were now not being given to these peasants, and how the forest and the pasture areas, which were in a way common in the earlier times, now became the preserve of the British, because British also wanted to control the forest areas, not only for wood which was being used in furniture which was being sent to Britain, but we also find that this wood was also being used in the construction of the railways during that time, and for various other purposes in terms of building the ships, etc. So British in a way used all sorts of resources which were available in India, and the kind of common resources in terms of forest and the pasture areas, they were also being taken away from the people, those who were using them from earlier times. And we also see that similar happened to the other common resources which were either in the form of ponds now, which were being used by the British for fishing areas. And so in that sense, the customary rights of the peasants, they were being taken away by the British during this time, and the kind of financial security which was required by the British, that was being given by the settlement to them, and the colonial state became comparatively more stable because of the continued coming of the revenue or the finances. And they also did not want to create any elaborate machinery of revenue collection, because they continued with the earlier settlement which was there in terms of the collection of the land revenue. And many times when they brought about changes in that, for example, we see that how zamindari settlement or the istimrari settlement was introduced for that matter, and how the zamindars they were given this kind of a right and to collect the revenue, and they were being compelled by their economic interest to support colonialism as well, because they became the allies of the British, and it proved very handy in that sense when during the revolt of 1857 we find that the zamindars and many of the rajas they supported the British. So we find that the land revenue assessment was initially set so high that the extensive default was seen during this time, and the sale of zamindaris was also observed. And we also see that how zamindars, they were deprived of their traditional social role, incorporating functions such as maintenance of law and order and bridges, etc. So in that sense, they made a lot of intervention in terms of the traditional social role of the zamindars, and the earlier kind of rights which were being given to the zamindars, they made interventions in them as well. And we find that when we tend to understand the kind of changes brought about by them, then there was a certain degree of the restructuring of the composition and the functions of zamindars. and we also find, but at the same time, that there was a great deal of continuity of older indigenous power structure as well. So, in that sense, how zamindars they supported the British and they became some sort of their allies during this time, and the support of the big zamindars, it was also an important aspect of the Bengal polity at that time, that they were assigned certain judicial and administrative duties associated with their revenue collecting rights as well. So, they were being used for other kind of tasks in which British indulged, and we find that when we in a way try to see them, that how unlike Marathas in the Deccan and Polygars in the south and Sikhs and Jats in north, the zamindars did not have any significant military capabilities despite large rental incomes and patronages which they could distribute. So, they did not have any military capabilities, or military responsibilities were not assigned to them, and this made the task of domination over colony by the colonial state much easier as well. So, we find that how the colonial state operated while it divested them of their traditional role and rearmed them with certain extra economic coercive powers like right to arrest and lock up tenants and auction their goods and cattle for arrears of rent through Regulation 7 of 1799, and it also allowed them to enjoy illegal avabs or the cesses or taxes of many times. So, we find that how British were making all sorts of interventions in the land revenue systems, and how zamindars they had to in a way behave or operate in the context of the British. We also see that in that sense, that how the people, those who were engaged in cultivation, they were to be seen, and the actual cultivation of the land was of course carried on by lakhs of peasants who were reduced to the status of the tenants of the zamindars. And we also see that Lord Cornwallis had also decreed that zamindars should issue written agreements to each cultivator, and these should specify what tenant was to pay. So, some kind of management was being done in that sense, and rules etc. they were being framed, and we find that how the position of the cultivators was such that how they were being reduced to the status of the tenant of the zamindars. And we also see that the Cornwallis in a way believed that this would prevent oppression by the zamindars, and in practice, however, no such written agreement or pattas they were being issued, and peasants were wholly at the mercy of the zamindar. So, that was one important aspect of that particular period, when we find that how peasants they were wholly at the mercy of the zamindars, and how zamindars they treated them during that particular period, and how they became tenant at will, and how they were being exploited by the zamindars during that time. And we also see that permanent assessment was the largest sum that could be got from land, and this was not accidental at all, because it was a very heavy and oppressive assessment, and we find that the officials, those who were in a way associated with the land revenue settlements, especially the permanent settlement, one of them, John Shore, he says that if a piece of land produced crops worth rupees 100, then rupees 45 went to the government and rupees 25 to zamindar, and only 40 was left to the cultivator. So, we find that how around 60% of the revenue was to be given to the British, maybe 55 to 60%, and then we find that how government was seeking more than 45 or nearly 45% of the crops which were being in a way grown at that time, and zamindars were left with 15%, and cultivator had only to sustain only at around 40%. So, this was some kind of a precarious or a dire situation for the cultivators, and we find that British they did not want to relent here, and they wanted to continue with this kind of with these kinds of arrangements where they could have more and more revenue for themselves. So that was one important aspect, and we will talk about these kinds of aspects further in our next lecture. Thank you very much.